Afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land we meet today and pay my respect to their elder, past, and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Then I pay my special respect to all the fallen heroes from Spring Revolution in Myanmar. I also thank this month's AMI presenter, Mr. Scot Marciel, and the interviewer, Nicholas Coppel. And I appreciate all our participants from different parts of the world for joining the AMI seminar today. Our AMI president, Nicholas Coppel, will open the meeting. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, May, and thank you everybody for joining us for this month's webinar. Tonight's speaker is Scot Marciel. Scot Marciel was the United States Ambassador to Myanmar from 2016 to 2020. He is a senior US career diplomat. He was also America's ambassador to Indonesia from the period 2010 to 2013, and also had diplomatic assignments in Turkey, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Brazil, and the Philippines. Quite a seasoned diplomat. In addition to those assignments, of course, he had time back in Washington, D.C. in the State Department, and worked in a number of senior roles there, including as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for all of Southeast Asia. And he was also Director of the Office of Maritime Southeast Asia, Director of the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia, and Director of the Office of South European Affairs. So quite an experienced diplomat. Since leaving the Foreign Service, he has taken on academic roles and is currently working as the Oksenberg-Rohlen Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University in California. He has recently published a book, which is what is the springboard for tonight's conversation. I'll show it here, if we can. It's not coming up too well on my screen, is it? The book is Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. So without further ado, I'll hand it back to you, May, and we'll have our interview with Scot Marciel. I should mention that following that, there'll be an opportunity for some brief questions. Obviously, Scott's not here, but I'll do my best to answer them, speaking, of course, on my behalf, not on the behalf of Scott. And I'll also announce the topic for our next monthly webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. So now I'll share the screen.
I was impressed reading your book about your detailed knowledge of Myanmar, and it reminded me that your background with the country is a lot larger than mine was. And indeed, when I first met you in Myanmar, I was quite struck by your knowledge. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your career history in terms of its involvement with Myanmar, to give the audience some idea of who you are and your familiarity with the country.
Sure thing, Nicholas. Well, I did spend most of my career before I went to Myanmar working on Southeast Asia, and part of that was two periods when I was the State Department sort of point person for Southeast Asia. So I was covering all of Southeast Asia from Washington. And particularly in the period 2005 to 2010, a lot of that work involved Myanmar, or Burma, as we've called it officially, because it was an issue of great interest to people in Washington, both in administrations and in Congress and outside of government. So I spent a lot of time in Washington working on Myanmar, traveled to the country multiple times, both 2005 to 2010, and then again 2013 to 2016 being based in Washington. So, I learned a fair amount of the background of the country, although, as you know, you never know as much as you wish you did.
Indeed. And drawing that, and in your book, you talk about historically Myanmar's most difficult long-term challenge has been to build a true sense of nation that incorporates all its people. Do you think, bring that up to date with the situation we're facing at the moment in Myanmar, do you think that the alliances that are now being forged on the battlefield and in opposition to the military regime are uniting the nation and have the potential to create this new, more inclusive sense of nation, which, as you note, has been missing historically?
Right. I think that the various elements of the resistance and the civil disobedience movement and so on have taken important steps to begin to overcome and deal with the mistrust that has characterized relations between the different communities for so long, as you know. So I think this is the sort of process that takes years. Thinking of my own country and the challenges we still have after decades and decades. So I think it's going to take years. I think it would be unwise to sort of suggest that in 2 or 3 or 4 years they can build that unity. But I think they've made some good headway. I think a lot of people have begun to shift their attitudes toward other communities in a really healthy way. And I think the resistance and the overall movement does have the potential to begin to build that true sense of nation, even if it's going to take quite some time.
And as you note in your book, part of that process is overcoming this Myanmar's obsession with, as you term it, if I may quote you there, Myanmar's obsession with ethnic and religious identity. I mean, these are really deep-seated concepts and feelings, which not just in Myanmar, I mean, each country has its own, but to overcome the way they've been formed in Myanmar will take, as you say, quite some time. But you see signs of that starting to happen.
Yeah, I think you've got a couple of issues here, right? And obviously the Myanmar people have to find the way forward on this. So as foreigners, and I know you feel this way too, we have to sort of watch and encourage, but obviously can't in any way try to offer the blueprint. I think you've got on one hand the fact that political rights and it's sometimes even citizenship are directly linked to ethnic identity, and that creates some challenges. And so I think how Myanmar deals with that issue is going to be challenging. And one of the things that struck me there was that the minority communities often were very opposed to anything that might reduce the role of ethnic identity, say in everything from identification documents and the like. I think because in our countries, for all the problems we may have with identity, it's ethnicity and religion are more important in terms of culture and heritage. They don't directly affect, for the most part, your political rights or your rights as a citizen. And so I think to the extent that Myanmar is able to grapple with this problem of showing respect and making it clear that all these different communities can enjoy strong their culture and show respect and continue their culture in every respect and the history and what have you, language, all those sorts of things. That's one piece. And the political and citizenship rights, hopefully, I think, in my view, need to be perhaps separated from that somewhat.
Right. So it's not about ignoring or denying these differences about ethnicity and religion, but about that a separation between what might define as one's identity and one's political rights, and not being
right. Right. I mean, that makes sense to me. Again, whether Myanmar people agree with that is a different question.
That's right. It's a question for them to decide. In your book, which I'll show here, you provide some really fascinating insights into the various forces within the United States that have helped shape or guide and drive America's policy towards Myanmar, and particularly in that period after the 1988 demonstrations. And I was struck by how engaged the US Congress was in considering issues within Myanmar, or Burma, as you note, is often it's called in the United States. And today, though, is the US Congress still so engaged? And perhaps you could give us some idea of who within the US and the various forces there, the Burma campaign and so on, who is taking the lead in US policy towards the situation in Myanmar today?
Sure. I mean, I think the situation has changed for a host of reasons. After the 1988 protests and demonstrations were brutally suppressed, Myanmar became sort of a cause among a number of people, particularly not only in Washington, but particularly in Washington. Some members of Congress, including the longtime Majority Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, but many other members of Congress were very taken by this cause and wanted to show support for the pro-democracy movements. A lot of people outside of Congress, in human rights groups and different advocacy groups were also very engaged. And so Congress really drove policy to a large extent in the 1990s and 2000s. I think that was less so beginning around 2010, where the Obama administration took a different approach, and then in response to the changes that took place in Myanmar beginning around 2011 and 2012. Now, I'd say Congress, some members are still very focused, and some influential staff in Congress are still very interested and very focused on this, probably as a whole, not as much as earlier. And some of that is because of focus in the foreign policy world on so many other crises, but also, frankly, because of some of the dysfunction in our own Congress, it's maybe less able to play that role. So right now, I mean, part of the problem, I think, with U.S. policy is there's not really a very active champion of a Myanmar champion who has a lot of influence either in the administration or Congress. I believe Senator McConnell is still very interested, but he's been somewhat less active on this issue. And within the administration, it's probably been the State Department counselor, Derek Chollet, who's been the most active. But again, there's no dramatic champion who can really shape, he or she can really shape policy. And I think that's reflected in a policy that's probably headed in the right direction, but lacking much energy.
Right. So it's giving more scope for the US State Department to take the lead. But if I understand you correctly, taking the lead is one thing, but you need the support of Congress and the enthusiasm of Congress as well to help achieve real outcomes.
Yeah, and I think, again, what my sense is both in Congress, because this has never really been a partisan issue. It's an issue that Republicans and Democrats have been quite supportive of seeing of pro-democracy efforts in Myanmar. But I think, frankly, Myanmar lost some of its support in 2017, 2018 with the Rohingya crisis. It damaged the image of Myanmar in a lot of places, but certainly in the United States. And so people still want to see the pro-democracy forces succeed, but perhaps there's not quite the enthusiasm that there was before.
A number of commentators have said that it's the distraction, if you like, of the crisis in Ukraine, and now, of course, in Gaza as well, which has displaced Myanmar. But you're talking about something more fundamental here.
I think there's a number of factors. Certainly, Ukraine and Gaza and the broad competition with China dominate the headlines and sort of suck up most of the oxygen in the room when it comes to foreign policy. And that's reinforced by the fact that you don't get much media attention on Myanmar in the major media in the United States. The New York Times ran a major story on it this week, and that was interesting because it was so unusual that Myanmar would get that kind of coverage. And some of that is just the reality of not journalists having a very difficult time getting access to Myanmar these days because of the danger. So it's not necessarily a conscious decision as much as just the difficulties. I think you combine that and the disappointment that came from the Rohingya crisis, and what you have is still the right approach, I think, of wanting the pro-democracy forces to be able to win out and develop some kind of federal system, federal democracy. But again, we haven't seen the energy and commitment and the resources behind that I would have expected.
I think with just observing or making an observation about that, one thing that struck me is with modern technology, we're seeing a lot more real-time reporting on what's happening in Myanmar. But I would share your view that a lot of that's not being picked up in mainstream media, or is being only picked up when there's been some major airstrike with a lot of civilian casualties. So it's very episodic rather than a continuing following, or indeed even the analytical type reporting isn't coming through as much as we might have seen in previous periods.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think at least early on after the coup in February of 2021, I think there was a widespread assumption that the military would prevail and hold on to power. And perhaps that led people to sort of say, well, we care, but what can we realistically do? And I think that's another challenge for people in the policy environment is what can we do beyond rhetoric and some sanctions and so on that would really have an impact? Where, for example, in Ukraine, you're able to provide aid to an existing government that still controls a large part of its territory that was democratically elected. It's a little bit easier. And then you have the strong support of NATO as well for that. So it makes it politically and logistically a lot easier. In Myanmar, you had, again, I think that assumption that the military would prevail, and that's only slowly changed. But also just real logistical, who do you send, even if you're not talking about weapons, but financial assistance? Does it go to the NUG, but does the NUG really lead the resistance? What about the ethnic armed groups? And then Myanmar's neighbors have not exactly been very supportive of that effort too. So how do you actually get things into the country? You can't just, wire money. You can wire money into Myanmar, but I don't think that's what you want to do for obvious reasons.
Yes, this whole question of how countries have responded to the coup and what they can do and can they do it better is actually the subject of a book which I'm working on at the moment, but we can leave that topic for another webinar. Traditionally, in terms of responses to the coup and to developments such as that around the world, the policy of the United States has been very much about applying pressure. And we see that wherever in the world there's some wayward government or activity, the US instantly goes to putting pressure on as a way of trying to encourage change. And typically that's been through the imposition of sanctions, and these days more targeted sanctions rather than economy-wide sanctions. In 2009, when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, you argued that heavy sanctions and pressure had not worked, and alone those measures were unlikely to succeed in the future. You also proposed to Secretary Clinton that in addition to some pressure, the US should engage with the regime. Engagement at that time, talking about that period, you argued would help build some relationships and improve understanding of what was happening in the country. So if we skip forward to today and we see targeted sanctions being applied progressively to more individuals and more entities, and a situation where we're not having high-level contact by the United States government, but nor Australian government and many other governments. But I'm wondering, what would your advice be to today's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken?
Yeah, generally speaking, I've been arguing that the US sort of approach of using punitive measures, sanctions, refusal to engage or limited engagement, public criticism, these sorts of things is often overused and not particularly effective. And so that's my general view. In the case of Myanmar now, though, I would not argue for engagement. I would argue for the sanctions for a couple of reasons. One, in 2009, 2010, even if the military government at the time didn't have a lot of popular support, there was no active movement against it. And so the US sanctions and maybe a few sanctions from a few others were kind of operating in a vacuum. Here you have tremendous pressure against the junta from within the country, obviously, in the form of resistance, civil disobedience movement, national unity government, and the like. And so the international community's financial pressure on the sanctions, adds or complements that domestic pressure. So I think it's a very different situation. And also in that context, some limited engagement with the military these days would just be a propaganda win for the generals who would happily receive a senior US official, make sure the pictures were everywhere, and use it to suggest that they had some kind of legitimacy. And I think that was less of an issue back in 2009 and 2010. And then third, I think there's just no evidence at all that talking to the generals in this current environment leads to anything. Lots of people have tried, as you know, and they are just, there's no reason to believe that engaging with them is going to lead to any change in behavior. So I'm not opposed to keeping open some lines of communication, not necessarily at super high levels, but without the big photo ops in Naypyidaw. I think that can be of some value. But at this point, I would, the exception to my general rule of engagement would be in this particular case, just because, well, the military is just beyond the pale, and you have such strong movement within the country against it. And I think engaging them now would be seen by many people, maybe most people in Myanmar, as a betrayal.
And indeed, many people are coming out now specifically to say that don't push the resistance and the NUG to negotiate now, because now is not the time. The senior general is not somebody you can be trusting in negotiations anyway.
Yeah.
And others are calling for a complete victory. I mean, it's a revolution, not a negotiation, which they're looking for, and changing the constitution, changing the role of the military in the country.
Yeah.
But I think
that's true, Nicholas. And I think, again, not for me to say, it's up to the people in Myanmar to say, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a time when dialogue and negotiations would make sense. But to me, that time would only be when the military was so weakened that they made it clear through actual actions that they were serious and willing to make major concessions. I mean, the NUG has said that they're open to talks, but with some preconditions. And I think those preconditions, again, not for me to determine, would have to be something that suggested that we, the military, are pretty desperate to get out of this mess. So we're willing to make major concessions. Until that time, though, I don't think it makes sense. And this is, I wrote a piece that was published over the weekend about the new UN Special Envoy, Julie Bishop, obviously very familiar to all of you in Australia. And to me, it's not about her skills or experience, which are extremely good, but rather, what can you do at this time when the environment, you're in a zero-sum situation in Myanmar. And so going in there and say, let's have a political dialogue, to me, doesn't make much sense.
Mhm. Well, that indeed will be the topic of our next webinar on the Australian Myanmar Institute, so I'm sure you'll be interested. So
Yeah.
do join us for that one. The Rakhine and the Rohingya feature prominently in your account of your term as ambassador, in United States ambassador to Myanmar. I was wondering how did this issue impact on perceptions of Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar? I mean, you've touched on this briefly already, but perhaps you could.
Yeah. Well,
Oh.
certainly in the United States, it had a profoundly negative impact on the image of both Myanmar and of the Aung San Suu Kyi. And of course, on the Myanmar military as well, although it's not like the military had a great image before that. I think it was, almost impossible to try to even to understand as a foreigner the level of animosity that went beyond the military, that was widely shared in the country toward the Rohingya. And I think that's the result of some of the identity issues we discussed earlier, that emphasis on that, but also years of propaganda portraying the Rohingya as some kind of threat, not only on an ethnic basis, but as a threat to somehow to the Buddhist heart of Myanmar. And a lot of people who were, really good and educated people shared that concern. And I think that was obviously really harmful. And then there was a lot of propaganda during the whole crisis that reinforced that. So it had a profoundly negative effect in the US and in a number of other countries and I think it still is affecting perceptions to this day.
Mhm. And reflecting on, we were both there, of course, at that time. It was certainly the dominant issue, but my recollection of the period, there are also a number of other things happening at the same time. I mean, the peace process and
Sure.
developments in the economy and so on. But reading your book, it seems to overwhelm your narrative of your time there. And is that a choice you've made in writing the book, or was I distracted by other issues more so than you were?
Well, it's a really good question. I think, I got there in early 2016, just ahead of the inauguration of the NLD government. And for about a year, there was a very positive view in the United States toward toward that government and toward the general trajectory of Myanmar. I think the Rohingya crisis and just every day in the newspapers and on TV, these horrible stories of thousands and tens of thousands of people fleeing into Bangladesh just kind of overwhelmed everything else. But it's also my sense that maybe it was a coincidence or maybe it was caused by the crisis. But I always also felt that the government, the NLD government, when that crisis really hit, it sort of took the wind out of the sails of a lot of other reforms. We didn't see the kind of political reforms we expected, even some economic reforms, certainly didn't see much progress on the peace process. So it either coincided with or caused an overall slowing, I think, of the reform process. And there's very little happening on the peace process. And even in terms of civil and political liberties, things seem to move backwards. There was the prosecution of the two Reuters journalists, but more than that, more and more people were being arrested for things that should have been legally allowed, domestic protests and the like. And so I think it's almost impossible to separate the Rohingya crisis from some of the other things that seem to be going wrong. And I mean, only the people inside the government at that time, should they ever be allowed out of prison, which I hope they will be, I hope can provide some more insight on, is it did they feel, because there was clearly a feel of being on the defensive, very much on the defensive at that time. And did that discourage other reforms as well, or did they just use up all their energy on dealing with the criticism on the Rohingya and therefore didn't have enough energy and political capital to carry out the other reforms? I don't know.
My sense is they were always much less concerned about international opinion, but it might have been the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi being reminded of the power of the military and being rather apprehensive about stepping on their toes and therefore halting anything which might cause the military to be upset. So the military having flexed their muscles led to the government being more deferential. But
yeah, no, that's a good point, and probably was part of the equation for sure. You had, I mean, it was always hard to tell, but I think there's no doubt that there was, particularly, you know, with the, you know, the assassination of Ukoni,
yes,
right? And then, and that sent shockwaves through the whole system. And then the Rohingya crisis and many other things. Certainly, there was a great deal of concern, legitimately, as particularly in hindsight, we can see now very legitimate concern about the military and the need to try to advance reforms, but without provoking a strong military reaction. Yeah, very true.
Going back to the Congress and administration, the United States has passed this, what they call the Burma Act, which is an acronym for the full name of the act. And that act, amongst other things, authorizes the provision of non-lethal assistance to ethnic armed organizations and assistance to strengthen federalism. There was a lot of excitement at the time when this act was passed, and this may be a media issue, but we don't seem to hear as much about it today. So I'm just wondering, you're in the United States, perhaps you can give us a sense of where that act is and what's been happening pursuant to it.
Yeah. In fact, I just saw an article in Voice of America this morning about it, talking about the numbers and so on. Part of the trouble is, you know, the sort of strangeness of our system, I guess, but that money authorized, that bill authorized or law authorized the spending of money. But authorizing it just says, you know, we authorize this much money to be spent, but it still has to actually be dispersed. There has to be an appropriations bill that actually makes real money available. And I'm not in Washington. I'm not following it as closely as I perhaps should. So, but as far as I know, there hasn't been a matching amount of money appropriated to match the numbers in the Burma Act. And again, if you're not a Washington insider, there's no reason anybody would know that. It would seem obvious that, well, they authorized $100 and something million, so therefore it must exist. Not necessarily. I think I know the US is providing some assistance. Some of it's humanitarian. Some of it, I think, is through USAID, and it involves, you know, strengthening local governance and so on. And that's certainly not going to the SAC. Absolutely not. That's probably going, for the most part, across the border, for areas where you know, resistance groups have set up local administrations. It wouldn't be for weapons, but it might be training or capacity building for people involved in local governance, education, healthcare, all of those sorts of things. So that money is continuing. It's probably not at the level that most people in Myanmar and I personally would like to see, but it is continuing.
When you were in Myanmar as ambassador, just as I did, you had a number of meetings with the Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing. I was wondering if you could give us your impressions of the person, what he was like, and what the nature of those meetings. I mean, not the content of the discussion, so not
Yeah.
your sense of the person.
Yeah, I mean, initially they started off reasonably friendly because we had seen with the Thein Sein government a lot of reforms, and the military from which Thein Sein came had, for the most part, not obviously blocked those. And so there was some hope that the military would continue to, not to block further reforms. And so we saw some hope. And my meetings with Men Online initially were, okay. He had indicated that, he supported the reforms and so on. But over time, it became pretty clear to me that he was actually not supportive of reforms, that he was not interested really in changing the behavior of the military. Obviously there was still major fighting going on, particularly with, say, the Kachin and others, and there wasn't much interest in that, in changing behaviors. And then during the Rohingya crisis, the relationship, the meetings became much more tense. And in those meetings, he revealed himself he'd talk about the national races and the races that belonged and those that didn't, in a way that might have made sense for him, but didn't make a lot of sense for me coming with a Western mindset. And so it got pretty tense. And after a while, it was harder and harder to get meetings. So for I think the last year or two, there were no meetings with him.
I must say, my meetings with him were always very awkward. At first, I felt it was, oh, he's seeing me because it's his duty, and he really wasn't very interested. But on subsequent occasions, my sense was more that he'd made up his mind on a range of things, and he wasn't interested in listening to me talk about an alternative perspective on anything, and which led me to think of him as a degree of arrogance, to be sure, but also a very stubborn man, not
Yeah.
one open to discuss things, not one interested in alternative perspectives on issues, which in a person in a position of leadership of the military, I won't say the country, but of the military, is a very dangerous trait. I mean, it means you can set yourself on a course and no one will bother trying to persuade you because they know you're not, those who are around him, close to him, won't even seek to try and change his mind or inject an alternative point of view because he's not receptive to that. I don't know if he sees it as a threat or is it just a power kick that he has. I suspect the latter. But it doesn't augur well for the country going forward. I mean, I don't see him as a man who, even in defeat, were that to become clearer, would be open to a negotiation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Nicholas. I agree. I had a similar perception, and it was almost as if, as you said, he felt like, well, I got to deal with these guys. But it was, not to let's have a serious discussion and see what they have to say. It was, this is just my performance. And I did deal with, I did talk to, as maybe you did, some other foreigners who came in and said, he's pretty smooth. I said, yeah, he's superficially smooth, but there was no, substantive conversation. And after a while, I came to the conclusion that not only that, but I couldn't trust anything he said. And I would contrast that with his deputy, General So Win, who I talked to probably as much, if not more. And my perception of So Win is he'd listened a little bit more. He didn't just directly lie about stuff. On the other hand, though, he would listen, but he was still so absolutely uncompromising and hardline. So it felt like a more real conversation, but it was no more productive in terms of getting them to think differently. And at one point with General So Win, who again, you know, would listen and sometimes listen to some difficult conversations. At one point, he was talking about the ethnic minority communities, and I was making the argument, which I thought was a good argument, that, you know, we both represented the majority and the longtime dominant force as men from the majority ethnic group in our countries. And in that situation, because we never faced the prejudice and the discrimination and these sorts of things, it was sometimes hard for us to appreciate what others felt. So I was trying to sort of say, you know, we're in some ways, you know, facing a similar challenge. And he looked at me like I was from Mars. It just absolutely is like, no.
Mm.
And, you know, he would say things like, we talked about trying to get a ceasefire with the KIA. And he'd say, we can't have a ceasefire because then what would I say to the widows of some of my men who died fighting them? So very uncompromising, more direct and more willing to listen, but equally uncompromising. And I think, to me, this is the mistake that some people outside of Myanmar are making, looking at the current situation as sort of, well, maybe Min Aung Hlaing will go. That wouldn't be a bad thing, but it doesn't solve the problem, because the problem, I think, is the institution.
Hmm. I felt that very much when they took a group of us, I think you were there, a group of ambassadors after the violence in Rakhine State in military helicopters for a tour.
Yeah.
And at first before we got on the chopper, my sense was, oh, this is going to be a whitewash. It's going to show us that everything is fine. And, you know, had to think about whether we would go or not go and participate in this charade. But the helicopter took us up there, and, you know, we saw villages smoldering. I mean, there was smoke rising from villages, and we saw villages, I mean, totally destroyed. And I realized that, no, they just wanted to show us that they don't care about our perceptions of what's happening. They wanted to show us what they'd done, and they were proud of it. I mean, it was the height of arrogance.
I remember that those trips, and what struck me, I came away with the impression that, because they would show us these things and then they would sit us down and say, now you understand the real situation, so can you go please explain that we haven't, you know, that what we're doing is totally appropriate. And I thought, I mean, talk about cultural gaps. I mean, that's our job to fill those cultural gaps. I couldn't fill that gap. It was huge. But either they didn't think they had done anything wrong, or somehow they thought that this would convince us that they were totally justified. It was like when Min Aung Hlaing I think it was when Secretary of State Tillerson visited. He saw Min Aung Hlaing, and Min Aung Hlaing took out his, you know, his book of photos showing atrocities allegedly committed by ARSA, as if to say, therefore, whatever we do to the Rohingya is justified. And it was just, to me, just revealed not only the gap in thinking, but the fact that they had been so isolated for so long that they thought that that argument would appeal to a wider community.
Yes, Min Aung Hlaing showed me that book of photographs during one of my meetings with him as well. But he also turned to a page which allegedly showed a Rohingya man with his family, and it included multiple wives and umpteen children, as if to say, you see, they've come here to take over our country if we don't stop them. And I said to him, well, if one Rohingya man has many wives, then there must be many Rohingya men who don't have any wives, you know, because there's just as many women born as there are men. And he didn't understand the logic of that.
Yeah, that's believable. Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the heart of the matter, right, Nicholas, that Myanmar's got lots of challenges, as any country does. But I don't know how they can even begin to tackle those challenges as long as the military remains so powerful. And so in that sense, I think the only real hope I see for the future of Myanmar is for the military to be pressured slash forced into surrendering a fair amount of that power. It doesn't guarantee a happy ending and a great outcome, but at least creates the opportunity, because we both know there's a lot of really wonderful people in the country who do want to build something that's different and better. And the military is in the way. So I think when people express concerns and doubts about, well, what if the resistance can't govern? What if it can't hold together? All of those things are possible. But to me, you have one path that involves risks and including the risk of failure, and another path that is guaranteed failure. Because we've seen it for 60 years. It's guaranteed. There is zero prospect of progress, durable progress with one path, and there's at least reasonable chance of progress, not perfection, but progress with another path. So maybe that's a simplistic way of looking at things, but that's certainly how I've come to think of it.
Well, I think that's the way the resistance and the national unity government are also seeing it. It's it's very different from the response at the Saffron Revolution. I mean, there's a clear determination that the military have to be out of government and they need to be thoroughly defeated. It's not a negotiation that's being sought. It's a fundamental reshaping of Myanmar, and to be sure, what that might look like and the role of ethnic minorities within a federal democratic union. Those are difficult, big questions which the various parties will have to come to some accommodation on, but with a lot of risk associated with that. But it's a risk that they've decided, and I fully understand it, to take. For the very reason that you mentioned, that the alternative has been pursued for a very long time, and it's definitely unpalatable and unacceptable. So let's go for something else. Is the approach that's being adopted.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I hope that some of the countries in the region, some of Myanmar's neighbors, are beginning to see that the military is not going to be capable of restoring stability and governing this country in any kind of effective way. And so I hope that there's some new thinking rather than the sort of knee-jerk, well, they're in power, so whether we like them or not, we'll just sort of treat them as the government. So perhaps that will begin to change to some extent.
Well, it seems to. I think China seems to be less supportive of the military regime, and willing to tolerate ethnic armed groups having victories on the border. And Thailand seems also to be, I mean, it's not a complete change, it's not a complete endorsement of resistance, but some less fulsome, if they ever were, of the military regime.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I certainly can't speak for the Chinese government, but I always thought, I doubt that they really liked this coup from the beginning, because their relationship with the military isn't all that great, and they had a pretty good relationship with the NLD government. And so any future government that might emerge out of this, I would think, would want to have good relations with China. It's such an important neighbor, and I don't think people in Washington or elsewhere should be overly concerned about that. I think that they should see that as a natural and perfectly fine thing. So I would expect that the Chinese will continue to be pragmatic.
Well, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy developed a good relationship with China, and a relationship more based on equality than the previous civilian military regime. The renegotiation of the Chao Phu port and the economic corridor agreements was to the benefit of Myanmar.
I completely agree.
Yeah. You conclude your chapters of your book on Myanmar by advocating for support for independent media, civil society, farmers, small business, and funding for scholarships, and also encouraging greater engagement with ethnic minority communities. and dialogue about what a future democratic union might take. And I think that's going to be increasingly important, particularly as a signal to to Thailand, China, the neighboring countries that an alternative is feasible and something worth engaging. These sorts of programs will all better prepare Myanmar for when military rule ends. But some would say the US needs to be thinking about the first step, how to end military rule. Should the US heed this call and support the armed resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question. One I've been wrestling with for some time. I think that the United States should make a decision that the only real, or certainly the best hope for progress in Myanmar is if the resistance wins. And when I say wins, not necessarily a full battlefield victory, but wins politically in the sense of forcing the military to surrender much, if not all, of its power. And then based on that, certainly a lot more assistance. Whether the US should provide weapons, I'm not sure of that. And part of my hesitation is you've got all the difficulties of, getting weaponry in there through the neighbors. You have, I think, some concern that I don't want China to see this as the US is supporting the democratic opposition because I think it'll be pro-US and anti-China. So there's it to be a little bit cautious, but I think certainly more financial assistance along with, of course, a lot of humanitarian assistance, more support for training of local administration. I think I'd like to see more of all of that. And let's face it, if you provide more financial assistance, that will help the overall effort, even in the absence of providing lethal support.
Scott, thank you very much for your comments. I've asked you, finished on a very difficult question, and you've answered it quite well. Thanks for those observations of based on your experience and your time there, and talking about your book, Imperfect Partners: The United States and Southeast Asia, which of course people can get through Amazon. Thank you very much again, and all the best.
Same. Thanks, Nicholas. I really appreciate it. It's good to catch up with you. I mean, we were both there together at a, as they say, may you live in interesting times, very interesting time. And I know we both came away with, really great admiration for so many people in Myanmar who've been through a lot, but are pushing hard for a better future. So I appreciate the chance to talk with you about it.
Yeah, it reminded me of Charles Dickens and The Tale of Two Cities. It's Tale of Two Cities? The opening lines, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
Yes, true. Well, let's hope for the best of times going forward.
Yeah. Let me see if some people have any questions. Please put them into the chat room. There's a question which has come in which asks, do I think Myanmar should fight or negotiate China and the wire to stop all arms and supplies coming to their proxies? I think that's as in should the Myanmar military fight or negotiate China and the wire? Well, I think I don't think that's likely. I think the Myanmar's military is rather preoccupied at the moment fighting groups within the country, and certainly if it were to start fighting with China, it's most unlikely to be successful. But I'm not one to be wanting to offer advice to Myanmar's military on how they can perform better. Well, while we wait to see if there are any other questions, I might mention that for next month's webinar, which will be on Monday, the 27th of May, the topic is going to be on the UN Special Envoy and the role of the Special Envoy. And as most of you will be aware, that Julie Bishop, a former Australian Foreign Minister, and indeed the minister who appointed me as ambassador to Myanmar, has taken on the role of UN Special Envoy, a position which has been vacant for quite some time. We won't have her as a speaker, but we do have an expert on the United Nations in Myanmar and on the history of the United Nations in Myanmar. And we hope also to have a couple of other speakers join him. So I won't mention the speaker lineup at this stage because it hasn't been finalized, but it'll be a very interesting session and a very topical one as well. Well, if there's no questions coming through, I'm happy to take questions, but in view of the time, we might leave it there, May, and thank our participants and audience for joining us tonight.